Inside the marble walls of the U.S. Capitol, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett faces off against Senator John Neely Kennedy over a controversial $900 million federal deal known as Project Phoenix. Kennedy mocks her intelligence on live television. But within minutes, Jasmine unveils a buried federal clause, authored by Kennedy himself, that renders the contract blatantly illegal. With undeniable evidence connecting money, influence, and key decisions, the room shifts from laughter to stunned silence. If one woman can dismantle a senator's empire in under 10 minutes, how many more are waiting to fall? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room of the U.S. Capitol crackled with tension. Marble floors gleamed beneath rows of media cameras, grim-faced aides and lawmakers clutching briefing folders like weapons. At the front, a massive projection screen blinked. FY 2025 Federal Budget Oversight. Project Phoenix Review. Presiding over it all was Senator John Neely Kennedy, seated like a Southern warlord flanked by loyal staffers. With syrupy confidence, he hailed the $900 million Phoenix project as a patriotic infrastructure miracle for the Gulf. But behind the scenes, whispers of nepotism, inflated costs, and shadow companies clung to Phoenix like ticks. At the minority table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, alone, sharp in navy blue, barely acknowledged. She wasn't just outnumbered, she was outscripted. Yet when she opened her laptop, her eyes fixed on Kennedy like a fighter sizing up the first opening. The war hadn't begun, but the breach was coming. No one expected her to come in with fire. She'd been written off before the hearing even started. Labeled a lightweight, a headline chaser, and off mic, the DEI hire they can't get rid of. To the room, this was Kennedy's show. She was set dressing, but Jasmine had read the script and all its hidden footnotes. She saw the buried line items, the duplicate payouts dressed as progress, and the redactions cloaked in national security. Project Phoenix wasn't just flawed, it was corruption with a patriotic label slapped on the front. The moment Jasmine touched the keyboard, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, not because of anything she said, but because everyone sensed what was coming. It was the stillness before a storm, the hush before the blade is unsheathed. She leaned forward slightly, the glow of her laptop screen casting a cold hue on her face, making her look more surgeon than Congresswoman. Her tone was precise, almost surgical. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice even but edged with steel, "I'm requesting clarification on line item redundancies listed in sections 19B, 22A, and 24F. Allocations labeled as new infrastructure spending, but linked to already funded initiatives from fiscal years 2022 and 2023. Her words hung in the air like static before lightning. On the screen behind her, she queued up a breakdown of the budget lines, project codes, contractor IDs, disbursement dates. It was clean, crisp, irrefutable. Yet the response was anything but. Kennedy didn't even glance at the data. He leaned back slowly, folding his hands across his midsection like a judge at a talent show, a wry grin curling into place before he even spoke. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice coated in sugar and gunpowder, "if you actually understand the federal budget, then I must be Einstein reincarnated." He chuckled, self-satisfied, and turned to his colleagues as if expecting applause. And he got it. Laughter rippled down the Republican side like a slow wave. Someone clapped softly. A reporter snorted, jotting the line in the margin of their notes, ready to spin it into a soundbite for late-night pundits. Even a few Democrats looked away. The condescension was so casual, so practiced, it had become performance. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't a lawmaker, wasn't a constitutional scholar, or a licensed attorney. She was reduced to a caricature, the outsider who dared to question the script. But she didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. And crucially, she didn't respond with anger. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to this hearing to prove herself with emotion. She came with proof. Her fingers resumed dancing across the keys, pulling up a second spreadsheet layered in forensic clarity, color-coded, time-stamped, cross-referenced. The screen lit up with duplication flags and contract metadata. Her voice dropped half a register, steady and controlled. "Let's verify that, Mr. Einstein," she said, turning her laptop ever so slightly so the panel could see. The silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was defensive, the kind that dares truth to keep going. Jasmine did. She advanced to her next slide with the deliberate calm of someone who'd already anticipated resistance. There was no flourish in her voice, no smugness, no drama, just facts. Cold, clean, arranged like the steps of an autopsy. For clarity, she began, her voice steady but now unmistakably louder, clearer. I conducted a comparative review of infrastructure spending allocations across fiscal years 2023, 2024, and the newly proposed 2025 budget. I focused on Region 6, particularly flood control and emergency reinforcement line items. Her hand moved with precision, scrolling through the Excel interface she had personally rebuilt from publicly available PDFs the committee barely skimmed. Her laptop projected onto the massive screen behind her, glowing with green cells, yellow flags, and red danger boxes. As the first slide came into focus, the air in the hearing room thinned. 3 columns labeled by fiscal year. Dozens of matching project codes began populating beneath them. No one moved, but dozens leaned ever so slightly forward, subconsciously. It was the kind of data that couldn't be ignored, even if you wanted to. She zoomed in on one entry, outlining it in a blood-red box. This, she said evenly, is Project Delta 14, officially described as Emergency Bridge Reinforcement, Coastal Evacuation Route 12. She clicked to bring up a detail pane. It appears in the 2023 budget, fully funded at $47.6 million. It reappears in the 2024 budget, this time under a slightly altered description. Same bridge, new code, $46.2 million. Another click. And now again, in 2025, under the name Delta 14A, funded for $49.1 million. For a split second, the room didn't quite register what they were seeing. The numbers were there, the language slightly altered each year, the contractor names swapped like musical chairs. But the geography? Identical. The scope of work? Identical. The project code? Nearly identical. Only the phrasing and paper trail had shifted. Slightly. Cunningly. Jasmine let the silence breathe. Then she delivered the line like a scalpel sliding beneath flesh. We are about to pay 3 times for the same piece of concrete? A wave of unease rippled through the room. Papers rustled. Someone coughed into their hand too quickly. Kennedy didn't speak yet, but his jaw had clenched, and the performative smile he wore earlier was now gone. Jasmine clicked once more. A new document opened. An inspection report. This is the completion certificate from the Department of Transportation, she said, enlarging it. It's dated March 11th, 2023. It confirms that the bridge referenced in Delta 14 was fully inspected, reinforced, and passed structural certification 18 months ago. She paused, let it sit. Then, it's done. Finished. Closed out. Yet here we are, seeing it again, now hidden under new code numbers and vague footnotes. No justification, no explanation. Just a recycled payout dressed in slightly different font. The projection slid to the next page, a string of internal contractor memos she had FOIA'd. A note from a project manager read, per Senator's office request, refile under secondary classification to avoid redundancy flag. Jasmine zoomed in on that single sentence. The phrase hung like a smoking gun. There was no way to explain that away. Not even Kennedy could pretend it didn't mean what it meant. She looked up from the screen and faced the room. Not just Kennedy, but the whole committee. Now I ask you, she said, her voice low but saturated with control, how does a completed bridge reappear in 3 consecutive budgets, under 3 different descriptions, each time with a multi-million-dollar price tag? No answer. Not even the Republican staffers behind Kennedy whispered. The joke was gone now. The show was over. Jasmine took a breath. Not a dramatic one, just the type you take when you've spent weeks holding it in. If this were a mistake, she continued, it would have been caught once, maybe twice, but 3 times, over 3 years, across multiple oversight bodies and budget offices? She shook her head slowly. This isn't sloppiness. It's a system designed to reward those who know how to camouflage theft with procedural language. Then came the slide that changed the temperature in the room permanently. A vendor list. All three iterations of Project Delta 14 in 3 years were awarded to three separate shell contractors, each owned by the same parent company. The parent company was headquartered in Louisiana. The owner, a longtime donor to Senator Kennedy's Political Action Committee. Jasmine didn't even need to say it. The room connected the dots themselves, but she said it anyway, softly, fatally. Three different names, one bridge, one wallet filling up again and again. If that's not laundering taxpayer dollars through paperwork, I don't know what is. The entire gallery behind her sat motionless. A few reporters' fingers fluttered over laptop keys, typing with the mechanical rhythm of disbelief. Even the C-SPAN cameraman zoomed in instinctively, close on her face, close on the screen, close on the unraveling. Kennedy still hadn't spoken. He hadn't blinked. For a man who'd built a career on one-liners, he now found himself on the receiving end of a sentence he couldn't finish. Jasmine finally leaned back. She looked neither triumphant nor vindictive, only tired. Tired of being told to sit down. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of seeing accountability treated like a sideshow. She glanced once more at the budget slides, those quiet columns of numbers that had tried to hide betrayal in plain sight. Then she looked at the committee, each member still silent, still stunned. "We don't need another bridge," she said. "We need to stop paving over corruption and calling it infrastructure." And with that, she closed her laptop. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was ruptured. Because Jasmine hadn't just pointed out an error, she had opened a vein in the machine. And now the whole room was bleeding. But Jasmine wasn't done, not even close. What she had just revealed was a bruise. What came next would be the bone beneath it, cracked wide open for everyone to see. She cleared the screen with a single keystroke, and a new slide emerged, this time with no numbers, no formulas. Just a name. Bold, stark, and centered on a black background. REDRIVERDYNAMICSLLC. The room tensed again. Kennedy's brow shifted, just slightly. But it was enough to register. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice tighter now, colder. "This is the firm awarded the $900 million sole source contract under Project Phoenix. According to the official record, Red River Dynamics was certified as a federal contractor exactly 14 months ago." 14, she paused, letting the number hang like a threat. That's just 2 months older than this fiscal year's budget proposal. In fact, it was incorporated 6 days after the preliminary funding language for Phoenix was quietly introduced in committee. Language written by this very chamber. The timeline sharpened into a blade. She turned her gaze directly toward Kennedy. And yet they were deemed qualified to handle a near billion-dollar federal project? No one answered. She didn't expect them to. Another click, another slide. This one showed the Red River Dynamics LLC Articles of Incorporation. Public records Jasmine had pulled directly from the Louisiana Secretary of State's office at 3:17 a.m. 2 weeks ago. "Here's where it gets interesting," she said, scrolling slowly through the document. The company lists a single principal. Barrett Crane. She tapped the name. A man with no prior experience in civil infrastructure, no military engineering background, no federal contract history. But what he does have, she paused, switching slides again, is a marriage license. The room stiffened. Up on the screen, a wedding photo faded in beside the incorporation record. Barrett Crane, arm in arm with Caroline Monroe. Jasmine didn't need to narrate the next part. She did it anyway, so there'd be no misunderstanding. Caroline Monroe is the daughter of Thomas Monroe. Mr. Monroe is one of the top 5 political donors to Senator Kennedy's campaign PAC. In the last 24 months, he's funneled $2.3 million into various state-level dark money groups and $250,000 directly to the senator's war chest. A ripple passed through the room, faint but real. Something in the audience exhaled. Something in Kennedy shifted again, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair. But Jasmine wasn't reading body language anymore. She was reading receipts. She brought up a final slide. 3 payments, each time stamped and linked directly to the campaign's PAC. each one falling within 10 days of Kennedy's statements in support of Phoenix at various closed-door budget meetings. "It doesn't stop at family ties," she said. "These are timed contributions. These are patterns, not coincidences. This is money moving just before policy does." The silence inside the hearing room had transformed. It wasn't just shock now. It was recognition of what had always been happening, of how far someone had finally gone to pull back the curtain. Jasmine stepped back from the screen, the glow casting sharp shadows across her face. "So let me ask again," she said, voice controlled like the click of a loaded chamber. "How does a company barely old enough to rent office space win a $900 million contract with zero competition, zero track record, and a direct family tie to a sitting U.S. senator?" Her question didn't need an answer. It was already screaming through every square inch of the room. But Jasmine hadn't come merely to connect dots. She came to detonate the lie at its legal root. The setup was over. What came next would make denial impossible. She tapped once, and the chamber lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind her shifted. The spreadsheets vanished. The payment charts disappeared. In their place appeared a black slide with a single white block of text, centered and unblinking, as if carved in stone. Section 14.3, Federal Appropriations Integrity Clause, 2021. There were no graphics, no photos, no dollar signs, just the law, plain, brutal, unforgiving. She stood to the side now, her silhouette outlined by the glow. Her voice came steady, like a judge reading from a sealed indictment. This clause was passed into law 3 years ago as part of the 2021 Federal Appropriations Oversight Package. She clicked again. The clause zoomed in, enlarged for all to see. No federal contract exceeding $10 million shall be awarded to any corporation, entity, or registered vendor less than 24 months in continuous operation. Her finger pointed to the line slowly, like it was radioactive. This is not a suggestion. It's federal law. Clear, specific, binding. She walked 2 steps forward. The sound of her heels echoed off the marble like gunshots in a vault. Then she turned back toward the committee, her tone low but rising in voltage with each word. And it was not just supported, it was authored by the man sitting at the head of this hearing, Senator John Neely Kennedy. The projection shifted again. Now it displayed a scan of the original congressional bill. Kennedy's name circled in red at the bottom, like a signature carved into steel. She let it sit there. Let the room read it. Let Kennedy stare at his own handwriting. "He called this amendment a safeguard," Jasmine continued. "He told the American people it would stop sweetheart deals and insider manipulation." Her voice dropped now, heavy with the gravity of betrayal. "He told us this would protect the taxpayers from political favors, disguised as federal contracts." She stepped back, letting the screen dominate the space behind her. "And yet," she said, her eyes locking back on Kennedy, "Red River Dynamics was 14 months old when it received a contract 90 times the legal threshold." Her next words came slower, sharper. They didn't just cut, they pierced. The very law that should have blocked this deal was written by the man who now defends it. And then, just before she spoke again, Jasmine felt the weight of the entire system pressing back, trying to silence her with protocol, with posture, with power. But that only sharpened her purpose. She hadn't come to win a debate. She had come to end the illusion that rules were only for the ruled. She stepped forward. The silence braced for impact. "So I ask you, Senator," she inhaled, just once, not for show, but to aim. "What exactly is this $900 million? A clerical error that just happened to benefit your donor's family? A bureaucratic oversight blessed by silence?" She took one final step forward, each word like a bullet breaking glass. "Or is it something far more miraculous? A $900 million exception to a law you yourself wrote?" And then she delivered it. The line that would be quoted, replayed, reprinted for years. "Tell us, Mr. Kennedy, is this a miracle that breaks the law, or is it a miracle that breaks you?" Her voice faded. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She let the screen behind her burn, and the room collapsed into silence. Not respectful silence, not political silence, dead silence. No one coughed, no one shuffled, not a single senator dared to speak, because what Jasmine Crockett had just done wasn't an accusation, it was an execution, and the body was still warm. Across the country, millions would replay that silence, again and again, because in that moment, a lie didn't just collapse, it confessed. But Jasmine wasn't done proving intent. Truth without timing is just noise. What she unveiled next wouldn't just suggest motive, it would graph it with clinical precision. She tapped the keyboard once more, and the screen behind her flickered, resetting to a dark gray background. Then slowly, deliberately, a new graphic emerged. Not a document, not a law, but something more dangerous. A timeline. The line stretched across the entire screen like a pulse line on a hospital monitor. On the top half ran a neat row of red markers, each labeled with the date of a Senate appropriations vote. Below them, aligned with eerie accuracy, were green financial bars, 5 bold and glowing, each labeled Red River Dynamics PAC, campaign contribution. Each donation came within 10 days, sometimes within 48 hours, of Kennedy voting in favor of specific budget proposals that would later funnel funds toward infrastructure contracts, including the now infamous Project Phoenix. The donations were modestly staggered, designed to look routine in isolation, but Jasmine had connected them like a surgeon stitching back a face someone tried to disfigure. She didn't speak yet. She let the graphics settle, let the facts take the first punch. Then she moved to the side, allowing the full image to tower behind her, and said softly, "Correlation without context is speculation, but correlation with sequence, that's intention." She clicked once more, and the room inhaled as if on cue. A large blinking percentage faded in across the top of the screen in bold white numbers. Correlation, 94.8%. Votes and contributions. No spin, no inference. Just the math, brutal and bright, screaming from 20 feet of LED glass. A few journalists in the gallery audibly gasped. A staffer dropped a pen. Somewhere the scrape of a chair shifted. Someone leaning forward, unwilling to look away. Jasmine's tone shifted now. Cooler, quieter, but somehow even sharper, like the silence before a scalpel makes its cut. 5 major contributions, 5 budget votes, all perfectly timed, all falling within a pattern so precise it could be set to music. She pointed to the bars again with her laser pointer. This wasn't random. These aren't coincidences. This is rhythm, strategy, symmetry. She paused to look Kennedy directly in the eye. This is choreography. Her voice darkened, edged with disgust, sharpened by restraint. Each vote cast unlocked a new phase of Phoenix funding, and each contribution, filed through a political action committee tied directly to Red River Dynamics, came just in time to grease the wheels. No competing bids, no oversight hearings. Just one company, one contract, and 5 perfectly timed deposits. She clicked again. A spreadsheet popped up beside the graphic, showing FEC filing dates side by side with official voting records. Each line a match, each timestamp a match, each vote perfectly predicted by a prior payment. And while the American public thought they were witnessing a legislative process, she said slowly, what they were actually watching was a transaction. The room had fallen eerily quiet again, but this time it wasn't stunned silence. It was anger without a voice yet, building beneath the surface of formality and procedure. Jasmine's eyes scanned the committee members. She saw it, the shift in posture, the tensing jaws, the sideways glances. She didn't need to ask if they understood, but she did want them to remember. She stepped closer to the screen, then turned back to the audience, her tone dropping to something almost conversational, but charged like a live wire. There's nothing illegal about receiving campaign contributions. There's nothing illegal about supporting appropriations. She let that hang in the air. But when every donation precedes a vote that benefits the donor, when each contribution is timed like a drumbeat to policy, when the money moves and the legislation follows, we are no longer in the realm of democracy. We are in the realm of pay to play. The room didn't breathe. Even Kennedy hadn't moved. He sat stone-faced but no longer composed. His knuckles were white, gripping the edge of his desk like a man trying to hold on to the last piece of ground beneath him. Then Jasmine stepped away from the screen entirely and returned to the mic. The screen behind her remained frozen, still showing that 94.8% match in defiant silence. She lowered her voice, not to be softer, but to force the room to lean in. "There's nothing more intelligent in politics than knowing when to vote," she said. "And it seems, Senator Kennedy, you've mastered the art of voting exactly when the money hits the account." That line didn't just cut. It landed like a confession delivered by the numbers themselves. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to. The data was the indictment. The screen was the courtroom. And the silence now? It was the sound of a reputation collapsing, not because someone shouted it down, but because someone finally drew the line and showed the country how the dots were always there, just waiting for someone brave enough to connect them. But as the data behind her burned through the marble calm of the chamber, Kennedy finally leaned forward, grasping for a ledge that no longer existed. His voice came low, roughened by years of courtroom bravado and Senate ritual, but this time it didn't land like command. It landed like retreat. "I don't control who donates to me," Senator Kennedy muttered, tugging once at his cuff as if adjusting decorum could fix optics. He forced a chuckle, a half-hearted attempt to paint the moment as political theater rather than unraveling truth. "People send checks all the time," he added, lifting his gaze only briefly. "I don't exactly ask for their birth certificates before I vote." It was meant to draw laughter, or at least a murmur of support, but the chamber gave him nothing. Not a smile, not a nod, only silence. The kind of silence that swells not from uncertainty, but from recognition, of a man falling behind the speed of his own defense. The donors may not have been in the room, but their fingerprints were smeared across every frame Jasmine had just projected, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't move. She just let the weight of his excuse collapse under its own breath. Then she took a single step forward, the light from the screen behind her casting sharp, angular shadows across her face. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with outrage, it was with control, measured, deadly. "No, Senator," she said quietly. "You don't control who donates to you." She let the concession hang there. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "But you do control what you say." Her eyes locked on him now, unflinching. "And what you don't." Her voice didn't rise. It tightened. The kind of tightening that draws an entire room forward, like a held breath before the crash. "You don't have to pull the strings if you know when to shut up," she continued. "You don't have to whisper orders when silence does the same thing. Your donors didn't need marching instructions. They just needed confirmation that you wouldn't ask questions while the money moved." She stepped aside slightly, motioning back to the screen still frozen with the 94.8% correlation glowing like a scar. 5 donations, 5 votes, each one fitting into place like a code. And not once did you raise your hand to say, "Something smells off." Her tone sharpened now, gliding into the edge between reason and fury. You didn't ask who was writing the checks. You didn't ask what they expected in return. You didn't even flinch when the company was 14 months old, had no track record, and was run by the son-in-law of one of your top donors. She turned her full body toward him now, planting herself square in the heart of the room. "You didn't need to rig the game, Senator. You just needed to pretend not to see how it was played." The words struck harder than a gavel, not because they were shouted, but because they were true, and everyone knew they were true. The aides stopped typing. The journalists forgot to blink. Kennedy sat still, but his silence betrayed more than his excuse ever hoped to deflect. "So maybe you didn't ask for that money," Jasmine said, voice like cooled steel. "But you stood very still when it arrived. You said nothing, you questioned nothing, you changed nothing." Then in one final pivot, she drew the last thread tight around his protest. "That's not innocence, Senator. That's complicity dressed in a better suit." In the room, it didn't just fall silent, it recoiled, because the defense had collapsed, and the truth had moved in to take its seat. The silence didn't linger, it transformed. It became weight. And in that weight, power began to shift like tectonic plates beneath marble floors. It began not with chaos, but with stillness snapping. Senator Holloway, a centrist Republican whose name rarely made headlines, slowly rose from his seat, shoulders rigid, lips pressed into a line that meant he had seen enough. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice brittle but deliberate, "in light of the evidence presented, I move for an immediate freeze on all Phoenix-related funding until a full ethics and procedural audit is completed." The room jerked to attention. His words were not dramatic, but they were decisive, and they hit like a verdict. Before Kennedy could even raise his gavel in protest, Senator Yvonne Ruiz, Democrat, fierce and unapologetic, leaned in, her eyes narrowed to steel. "I second that motion," she snapped, "and further demand this committee initiate a full inquiry into financial entanglements between the senator's office and entities tied to Red River Dynamics." The lines weren't blurred anymore. They were crossed, and now no party flag could protect him from what was no longer partisan. It was prosecutorial. The hearing room twisted into a new kind of silence, not stunned, but activated. Several aides began flipping through briefing folders with the urgency of people who suddenly realized they were sitting on political dynamite. Others pulled out their phones, texting at a pace that suggested collapse or coverage, depending on which side they served. Kennedy opened his mouth, but all that escaped was a soundless breath, like a man watching the rope he once held snap strand by strand. Across the gallery, news cameras zoomed tighter, angling to catch the full scale of a man outnumbered, not by votes but by facts. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't have to. Her truth now spoke through the voice of senators who, moments earlier, had dismissed her as noise. But Jasmine hadn't just made herself heard. She'd weaponized the truth until it became contagious. Outside, Washington cracked open. The first banner ran across major networks like a thunderclap. "Breaking: Jasmine Crockett uses Kennedy's own legislation to expose $900 million Phoenix scandal." Within minutes, the second followed. "Bipartisan revolt erupts after explosive hearing. Kennedy under fire for financial conflicts." And then came the third. "Phoenix project suspended. Federal watchdogs mobilize." Reporters shoved microphones into any mouth leaving the building. "Did you expect this? Do you believe the senator broke the law? Is Crockett leading a new ethics caucus?" The air outside the Capitol felt charged, not with celebration, but with reckoning. For the first time in years, the words oversight and consequences shared the same breath. And deep within the chamber, where marble and ambition usually smothered accountability, the walls were beginning to sweat. And Jasmine, she just watched, not with glee, not with vengeance, but with the calm of someone who didn't fire the first shot. She just lit the fuse that made the truth explode. The silence that had gripped the Senate chamber was shattered not by words, but by the digital roar of the outside world. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's searing cross-examination, a video clip of her dismantling Senator Kennedy with his own legislation ignited across social media platforms. The footage, raw and unfiltered, showcased Crockett's unwavering poise as she held Kennedy accountable, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. The clip's virality was unprecedented. Millions viewed, shared, and commented, turning a congressional hearing into a national reckoning. News outlets scrambled to cover the unfolding drama. Headlines blared, "Crockett turns tables on Kennedy," "Senator's own law used against him," and "Phoenix project under fire." Cable news loops replayed the exchange incessantly, analysts dissecting every nuance, every pause, every inflection. Editorials praised Crockett's tenacity, labeling her a rising star and a beacon of accountability in a murky political landscape. The public, galvanized by the spectacle, demanded more than just commentary. They sought action. Grassroots movements mobilized with astonishing speed. Online petitions sprang up, amassing tens of thousands of signatures within hours, all calling for a comprehensive audit of every budget allocation Kennedy had supported. Town halls and community forums buzzed with discussions, citizens voicing concerns over potential systemic corruption. Social media campaigns under hashtags like #AuditKennedy and #Justice for Taxpayers trended nationwide, reflecting a collective demand for transparency and reform. In the corridors of power, The atmosphere was palpably tense. Senators from both sides of the aisle convened in hushed meetings, the usual partisan lines blurred by the gravity of the situation. Calls for Kennedy's resignation grew louder, some colleagues distancing themselves, others openly criticizing his actions. The Senate Ethics Committee announced a preliminary review, signaling the potential for formal investigations. Kennedy, once a stalwart figure, now appeared isolated, his political future hanging in the balance. Amidst the turmoil, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. She declined numerous interview requests, letting her actions speak louder than any soundbite. Her office released a brief statement. Accountability is not optional, it's a duty. Supporters lauded her integrity, while detractors struggled to mount a coherent defense. In a political climate often marred by obfuscation, Crockett's clarity cut through, resonating with a populace weary of excuses. As the days progressed, the ripple effects of the hearing continued to unfold. Legislative aides reported an influx of calls and emails from constituents demanding oversight and reform. Think tanks and watchdog organizations began compiling reports, scrutinizing past appropriations linked to Kennedy. The Phoenix Project, once heralded as a flagship initiative, now faced suspension pending further review. The momentum for change, ignited by a single moment of truth, showed no signs of abating. In the annals of congressional history, few moments have resonated as profoundly as Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Senator Kennedy. It served as a stark reminder of the power of accountability and the impact one determined individual can have in challenging the status quo. As the nation watched, a new chapter in political discourse unfolded, one where transparency triumphed over obfuscation and justice over complacency. And yet, what good is clarity if it dies in silence? The crowd stood, but the air between them was heavy, like history itself holding its breath. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from restraint. This was the moment every sleepless night had led to, every funeral attended in silence, every letter never answered. But she didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, like a conductor before the final movement. "You stood for the dead," she began softly. "Now stand for the living." A murmur rippled, but it wasn't noise. It was awakening. She walked down from the stage, not with swagger, but with sacred weight. Her eyes didn't scan the crowd for agreement. She looked for the ones who were unsure, the ones gripping the edge of belief, the ones who hadn't spoken because they didn't know if it mattered. She spoke to them now. "They tell us to move on, to stop blaming podcasts, to stop blaming disinformation, but moving on without accountability isn't healing. It's surrender." Behind her, the screen came alive. It was no longer charts or faces. It was mirrors, real people holding real photos. Ruby, a father who died in Kansas, a teacher from Baltimore, a daughter who still kept the last voicemail from her mother who refused treatment because of what she saw online. If we don't hold the architects of this deception accountable, then we've learned nothing. And if we've learned nothing, they'll do it again. Different virus, different lie, same result. Jasmine raised a tablet above her head, one file open. "This is draft legislation, the Digital Transparency and Truth Act. No music played, no banners unfurled, but something seismic cracked through the silence. It demands full disclosure of financial ties for public health content. It criminalizes targeted disinformation campaigns during national emergencies. It gives the FTC the teeth it was stripped of years ago. It makes truth, for once, legally defensible." And then, her voice hardened, "It doesn't ban speech. It bans manipulation. It doesn't silence dissent. It silences profit-motivated deceit disguised as dissent." The crowd murmured louder now, some unsure, some ignited. "Don't clap. Don't repost. Don't hashtag. Demand this from your lawmakers. Show up. Call them. Corner them. Tell them Ruby mattered. Tell them you remember the cost." She didn't wait for applause. She turned, began walking. But the camera followed. And the audience, suddenly, wasn't just in the room. It was in living rooms, on sidewalks, on hospital break rooms, on the back steps of churches, across the country, across all the places where grief had long since gone quiet, but never cold. "This isn't about one death," she said into the next microphone, now at a press conference 3 days later. "This is about how we built a culture where a lie is easier to find than a hospital. And we called that freedom." Reporters flinched. Networks edited for the 6 p.m. broadcast, but people heard it uncut online. "You want a real First Amendment debate? Let's have it. But first, tell me why a 22-year-old with no medical license can broadcast to 10 million people about heart inflammation and get paid more than a surgeon saving lives in an ER." She dropped a name, then another, then an organization. Their legal team stirred, but the crowd didn't blink, because she wasn't punching. She was unveiling. This isn't about punishing skeptics. This is about exposing merchants of chaos. If your model needs ignorance to survive, it's not journalism, it's trafficking. The scene blurred again. Jasmine on a school stage this time. Auditorium packed with students too young to remember the early pandemic, but old enough to inherit its aftermath. She asked them a question. "Who do you trust?" Silence. "Not because I want an answer, but because I want you to wonder why it's so hard to give one." Then she pulled a copy of The Plague by Camus from her bag. "You want to fight tyranny? Start by fighting the temptation to believe the loudest voice. Truth doesn't scream. It survives." They didn't cheer. They stood. Again. But this time they moved. Clips went viral. A retired nurse from Nevada announced she'd come out of retirement to join a nationwide truth audit task force, a nonprofit formed within weeks called Ruby's Echo, with the sole mission of tracing funding ties in health media and flagging disinformation in real time. Former data scientists at social media platforms resigned and joined the effort. Whistleblowers came forward. A father in Indiana set up a website titled Last Words Unheard, where families could submit the final texts or voicemails of loved ones lost to vaccine denial. It crashed within 2 hours due to demand. At a White House briefing, a reporter asked the press secretary, "Will the administration support Crockett's legislation?" The answer came 3 hours later, from the president himself. "The truth is under attack, and we need new armor." Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't appear on every talk show. She didn't publish a memoir. Instead, she went to Ruby's old church, sat in the back pew, listened to the organ, and prayed not for peace, but for stamina. Because the real war hadn't ended. It had just been named. The silence that had gripped the Senate chamber was shattered not by words, but by the digital roar of the outside world. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's searing cross-examination, a video clip of her dismantling Senator Kennedy with his own legislation ignited across social media platforms. The footage, raw and unfiltered, showcased Crockett's unwavering poise as she held Kennedy accountable, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. The clip's virality was unprecedented. Millions viewed, shared, and commented, turning a congressional hearing into a national reckoning. News outlets scrambled to cover the unfolding drama. Headlines blared, "Crockett turns tables on Kennedy," "Senator's own law used against him," and "Phoenix Project under fire." Cable news loops replayed the exchange incessantly, analysts dissecting every nuance, every pause, every inflection. Editorials praised Crockett's tenacity, labeling her a rising star and a beacon of accountability in a murky political landscape. The public, galvanized by the spectacle, demanded more than just commentary. They sought action. Grassroots movements mobilized with astonishing speed. Online petitions sprang up, amassing tens of thousands of signatures within hours, all calling for a comprehensive audit of every budget allocation Kennedy had supported. Town halls and community forums buzzed with discussions, citizens voicing concerns over potential systemic corruption. Social media campaigns under hashtags like #AuditKennedy and #Justice for Taxpayers trended nationwide, reflecting a collective demand for transparency and reform. In the corridors of power, the atmosphere was palpably tense. Senators from both sides of the aisle convened in hushed meetings, the usual partisan lines blurred by the gravity of the situation. Calls for Kennedy's resignation grew louder, some colleagues distancing themselves, others openly criticizing his actions. The Senate Ethics Committee announced a preliminary review, signaling the potential for formal investigations. Kennedy, once a stalwart figure, now appeared isolated, his political future hanging in the balance. Amidst the turmoil, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. She declined numerous interview requests, letting her actions speak louder than any soundbite. Her office released a brief statement. Accountability is not optional, it's a duty. Supporters lauded her integrity, while detractors struggled to mount a coherent defense. In a political climate often marred by obfuscation, Crockett's clarity cut through, resonating with a populace weary of excuses. As the days progressed, the ripple effects of the hearing continued to unfold. Legislative aides reported an influx of calls and emails from constituents demanding oversight and reform. Think tanks and watchdog organizations began compiling reports, scrutinizing past appropriations linked to Kennedy. The Phoenix Project, once heralded as a flagship initiative, now faced suspension pending further review. The momentum for change ignited by a single moment of truth showed no signs of abating. In the annals of congressional history, few moments have resonated as profoundly as Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Senator Kennedy. It served as a stark reminder of the power of accountability and the impact one determined individual can have in challenging the status quo. As the nation watched, a new chapter in political discourse unfolded, one where transparency triumphed over obfuscation and justice over complacency. The world had not yet caught its breath from the political quake Jasmine Crockett unleashed on Capitol Hill, but she was already back on her feet, this time not behind a glowing screen in the Senate chamber, but before a sea of young, rising minds at Howard University. The auditorium lights dimmed except for the soft, golden beam that followed her onto the stage like a spotlight chasing justice itself. Phones were raised, live streams rolled, and even the air felt reverent. Jasmine stood alone, no staffers, no aides, just her, a wireless mic, and the raw power of a woman who had turned a moment of mockery into a national moment of reckoning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her opening words cracked through the silence like the sound of truth piercing a vault of denial. "They said I wasn't smart enough to read a federal budget," she began, each word deliberate, like loading a verdict into the chamber. "They laughed. They scoffed. They called me a headline chaser, a DEI hire, a second-rate lawyer." The audience remained still, breath held. But I didn't come to play optics. I came to read the fine print, the same fine print some folks sign, but never expect to see again. Heads began to nod, eyes widened. What followed was not a speech, it was an awakening. She lifted her hand and clicked the remote. A still image of Kennedy's circled signature on the infamous Section 14.3 flashed across the giant projector screen behind her. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. Jasmine didn't smile. She let them soak in the weight of that image before delivering the line that would etch itself into memory. "Intelligence," she said slowly, "doesn't need to shout. It just needs the right timing and the right statute." The room rose to its feet. Applause thundered across the marble halls of Howard like a verdict delivered by the people. Outside the university walls, the media was not silent either. Articles poured in like a floodgate opened. The Washington Post led with, "Jasmine Crockett dismantles Kennedy with his own law, a masterclass in legal precision." The Atlantic went deeper, proclaiming, "She's not just a congresswoman. She's the nightmare of every man who ever assumed a black woman couldn't read a balance sheet." Op-eds hailed her composure, her strategic brilliance, and her refusal to fight fire with fury. Instead, she had used evidence like scalpel steel, silent, clean, and fatal. One columnist wrote, "What Crockett did in that chamber wasn't debate. It was cross-examination before a jury of the nation." Back at Howard, Jasmine stepped away from the podium for a moment. She looked out across the crowd. Students from law, political science, engineering, and public health. All watching her, all absorbing not just her words, but her very posture. And then she offered what no politician on the Hill had dared to deliver that week, a challenge. "Ask yourselves," she said, voice low now, carrying more power than the shouting men on Capitol broadcasts, "if someone they dismissed as a second-rate lawyer could dismantle a sitting senator with the very law he authored, then how many more truths are hiding behind the curtain of too complicated for you to understand?" The auditorium went still again, deeper than silence. It was realization. It was fury being converted into focus. Jasmine's eyes swept the crowd one last time before she whispered, almost to herself but loud enough to matter. They fear the moment we all realize we were never supposed to stay in the audience. We were always meant to take the stage. That night, the video of her speech spread even faster than the Kennedy clip. Social media users captioned it, "Harriet with a hard drive. This generation's Thurgood in heels. The new blueprint." Some mocked, some tried to downplay, but the rest of the world, millions watching, understood the undercurrent. Something had cracked, not just in the political sphere, but in the American psyche. A narrative built on underestimation had just been publicly buried. The next morning, a young girl in Baltimore named Tia, 12 years old, printed Jasmine's quote and taped it above her bed. In Jackson, Mississippi, a retired postal worker wrote a letter to Jasmine's office. "I didn't think anyone could look those men in the eye and win, but you did, and I wept." And in Tallahassee, a professor restructured her public policy class, now calling the week's topic Crockett versus Corruption, a case study in tactical brilliance. In every corner of the country, people were no longer just watching. They were waking up. And so the final question remained, not shouted, not dramatized, just lingering like a candle at the edge of a dark room. If one woman they tried to silence could bring a senator to his knees with nothing but timing, truth, and his own law, then how many more lies are still waiting to be undone? And who tomorrow would be brave enough to speak next? The applause at Howard had long faded, but the questions Jasmine Crockett had stirred still echoed. Louder now across households, campuses, boardrooms, and barbershops. Her confrontation with Kennedy wasn't just a political scandal. It was a mirror, a challenge, a reckoning. It proved that in a system built to silence certain voices, those voices could still become the force that breaks it open. But even as the headlines praised her precision and the public hailed her courage, Jasmine knew the deeper battle wasn't about one senator or one law. It was about something far more fragile. The soul of belief, the right of the underestimated to rise, the power of silence to speak, and the capacity of truth to survive cynicism. Because beneath the thunder of that capital confrontation lay a quieter, more devastating truth. Jasmine had not simply been fighting Kennedy. She had been fighting the inherited contempt baked into every smirk that dismissed her intelligence, every whisper that questioned her legitimacy, every rule written with invisible ink that says, "People like you don't belong here." She had stood at that hearing table not as a nameplate, but as a warning that the America of excuses, of protected corruption, of hollow civility masking betrayal, was on borrowed time. And it wasn't just Jasmine who felt that fight. It was the single mother working 2 jobs who watched the hearing in her break room and whispered, "Finally." It was the immigrant son studying late into the night, now seeing that policy could be pierced with logic and grit. It was the veterans who'd been promised new roads and clean water, only to find themselves pawns in a contractor's profit scheme. To them, Project Phoenix wasn't a scandal. It was their stolen future, disguised in spreadsheets and campaign donations. Jasmine didn't just expose a lie. She gave their pain a name, and once injustice has a name, it becomes harder to bury. That was the lesson. Justice isn't loud. It's precise. It doesn't always storm the gates. Sometimes it enters the room quietly, opens a laptop, and reveals the ledger of betrayal. But it needs something else, something rarer than outrage. It needs patience, preparation, and the courage to hold your fire until the moment truth lands like a blade. Jasmine didn't retaliate when she was mocked. She waited. She let the data speak. She used their rules, their words, their signatures against them. Because true brilliance doesn't roar, it calculates. And when the time is right, it shatters. This is what the public saw in her. Not just defiance, but discipline. Not just fire, but focus. They saw what happens when someone who was never meant to have a seat at the table builds her own platform and uses it not to scream, but to surgically dismantle the very lie that tried to erase her. Jasmine's journey was never just about proving she was smart. It was about showing what happens when a system finally underestimates the wrong woman. And in that moment, America saw itself. Not the version draped in slogans or wrapped in polished speeches, but the version it often tries to ignore. Unequal, cynical, rigged. But also the version that could still be corrected, still be humbled, still be held accountable, if only enough people dared to do what Jasmine did. Study the truth in silence, and then speak it with precision. In the weeks that followed, her image became more than viral. It became viral proof. Proof that you didn't need a dynasty to deliver justice, that you didn't need a donor network to challenge a throne, that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they forgot to fear. And so, a generation watched, not to be entertained, but to be emboldened, not to cheer for spectacle, but to learn the anatomy of a reckoning. Because in the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't just dismantle a budget. She dismantled an illusion that the powerful are too untouchable, too protected, too clever to ever fall. But fall they did, not to fury, not to noise, but to facts. And that is the lesson no one can spin. Not Kennedy, not the donors, not the pundits. Because once truth is spoken with clarity, there's no unhearing it. And so, as Jasmine stood in front of those students, as the nation rewatched the footage, as the lawmakers read the polling shifts and the headlines piled in, one final question hovered in the air like a match above dry grass. What would happen if more people like her stopped waiting to be invited and simply arrived with the truth in hand? That, in the end, is the real fear of the powerful and the real hope of the rest. The storm Jasmine unleashed didn't end in that marble hearing room. It spilled into the streets, into living rooms, into hearts. But her greatest victory wasn't toppling a senator. It was waking up a nation that had forgotten how to fight. The morning after Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed through the chamber like a cannon blast, the headlines were unrelenting. Crockett versus Kennedy, the law turned inside out. A senator cornered by his own statute. One clause, one woman, one collapse. But outside the glare of cameras and op-eds, something far more powerful was taking root. Not in Washington, but in Tulsa, in Oakland, in Louisville, in schools and barbershops and bus stops, places that had long been used to watching history, not writing it. Now they felt it beating inside them, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't walk out of the Capitol to applause. She walked into a battlefield, one where the next victory wouldn't be won by legal citations, but by human conviction. Her voice had punctured the armor of indifference, but the wound needed to be kept open long enough for change to seep in. 1 week later, she took the podium again, not under oath, not flanked by political theater, but in a cracked auditorium at Howard University. No cameras, no makeup crew, just students, teachers, janitors, and a few community leaders who had walked 5 miles to hear her speak. The air was heavy with curiosity and something else, belief, brittle and newborn. She didn't start with a greeting. She started with a sentence that cut like a scalpel. Intelligence doesn't shout. The room hushed. It waits, it studies. It speaks once, and only once, when the moment is so precise, the lie can't breathe. Gas flickered from the corners. She didn't pace, didn't wave. She stood still, a silhouette of calm fury. That moment came, she continued, when a senator who thought I couldn't read watched me read his legacy back to him, word for word, law for law, until the room stopped breathing. The crowd erupted, not in noise but in stillness, a kind of reverence only felt when truth hits bone. But Jasmine wasn't here to be admired. She was here to ignite. She clicked a remote, and behind her, a screen flickered on. Not with photos or headlines, but with a map of America. Red dots glowed at every site where public money had been funneled into suspicious contracts. Phoenix wasn't an outlier. It was a prototype. And her voice didn't tremble as she said, "There are 1,000 more. 1,000 cities with bridges paid for 3 times. 1,000 Red River dynamics with different names. 1,000 politicians cashing in on public trust." And so she asked them, "What now? Do we clap and move on? Or do we dismantle the machine bolt by bolt. A student in the back stood. How? She smiled, not gently, fiercely. You start with the money, she said. Follow every check, every vote, every last-minute clause slipped into a 600-page bill. She pointed to a list scrolling on screen. Tools for transparency, budget portals, watchdog groups, whistleblower protections. She didn't preach. She handed them weapons. Then she leaned in. We were taught to believe the system is too big to fight, but systems bleed, and all it takes is one cut in the right artery. Another hand rose. But we're not in Congress. No, she said, but Congress is in you, your tax dollars, your silence, your voice. You can flood their inboxes, crash their hearings, organize your streets. You can vote in the school board that teaches your children how this works. You can break the myth that power is distant, because it's not. It's standing right here, in your shoes. The crowd rose, not for her, for themselves. And then she issued her call, not a plea, not a slogan, a warning laced with fire. If you do nothing, they'll keep building bridges to nowhere, burying your futures in cement poured by their donors. She let the silence sink its teeth in. But if you fight back, if you refuse to be quiet when someone says, you're not smart enough, then you make every lie tremble. Because the truth, when armed with discipline, doesn't need to scream, it only needs to show up. People began to film, not because she asked, but because they knew something real was happening. Then she walked off stage. No music, no confetti, just 20 new voter registration cards passed out in the hallway. Just 3 kids who started a hashtag by sundown. Just one grandmother who said, I'm calling my congressman tomorrow. I've had enough. That's what Jasmine left behind. Not applause, a blueprint. By midnight, her words had traveled farther than any televised speech. They became t-shirts, murals, student essays. A fire passed hand to hand, not celebrity, power redistribution. And while Kennedy hid behind press releases citing stress-related recovery, Jasmine kept moving. She visited a high school where textbooks hadn't been updated since Bush. She sat with union leaders who just discovered their pensions were invested in companies tied to Project Phoenix. She released a public toolkit called Know Your Contracts, designed to help anyone trace suspicious government funds. In every interview, she refused to say victory. Instead, she said, round 1. Because the truth about corruption isn't that it's hidden, it's normalized. It wears suits. It smiles on television. It hides in legalese so dense the public gives up. But Jasmine had cracked the code, and now she was handing out the cipher, and people were listening. Congressional hearings across the country saw spikes in attendance. FOIA requests increased 400% in 2 weeks. A new bill, dubbed the Crockett Clause, was proposed by a bipartisan group to limit sole-source federal contracts. Not because the system was suddenly pure, but because someone had lit a match in the dark, and now everyone could see the rot. Jasmine Crockett never called herself a hero. She didn't wear that badge. She wore scars, the kind earned in public humiliation, in being underestimated, in being told this isn't law school by men who thought sarcasm was smarter than substance. But now they whispered her name in Senate halls, not as a threat, as a change in temperature, and she wasn't finished. In her next speech, she opened with just one line. If one woman with a laptop can crash your whole narrative, maybe the narrative was hollow all along. The crowd didn't cheer. They rose. Because a system can't survive a population that stops fearing its paperwork. And Jasmine Crockett had taught them all how to read. If a woman once dismissed as a law school mistake could unravel a multi-million-dollar scam with a projector and a statute, what else have they hidden simply because no one thought to ask? And more importantly, will you be the one to ask next? But movements don't survive on memory. They survive on momentum. And Jasmine knew that speeches were not enough, not anymore, so she didn't retreat to comfort. She went into the belly of what others feared, town halls with no air conditioning, counties that hadn't seen a federal representative in 10 years, neighborhoods where people had long given up on knocking. She knocked, and when they answered, she didn't ask for votes. She asked for receipts, for school contracts, for broken pavement budgets, for water systems repaired on paper but still coughing brown sludge into kitchen sinks. She carried with her a battered black notebook, half filled with names, dates, and federal award codes. The other half was empty, meant to be filled by them, by the people, because the real revolution wasn't the moment she brought Kennedy to his knees. It was when the people realized they never needed him to stand in the first place, and the whispers became chants. At grocery stores, check the line items. At city council meetings, where's the funding trail? At church basements and barber chairs. If she could find it, so can we. It wasn't glamorous, but it was viral. Not on TikTok, but in the bloodstream of a reawakened democracy. Somewhere, a 14-year-old in Mississippi pulled up a grant tracker for the first time. Somewhere else, a retired teacher in Kansas wrote her first FOIA request. Somewhere in the same city where Kennedy once held court unchallenged, a local journalist clicked publish on a story titled, "The Next Red River. What's hiding in our budget?" Jasmine didn't need to be in every room anymore. She had weaponized something far more